Story 1. The Tunnel That Hummed My Name. I was just supposed to be updating backroad maps for the county, tracing old coal routes near Harlan that had either eroded into the hills or been swallowed by the forest. It was part of a contract gig. Not glamorous work, but quiet, which is what I wanted. I'd pack up my topo maps and compass, drive out in the early light, and spend hours alone with creeks, stone outcrops, and the hush that lives between dogwoods and pine. The job kept me moving and kept my mind away from things I'd rather not feel, like my brother, Caleb, or what happened in the lake the summer he didn't come back up. It was early October when I first noticed the tunnel. I was walking a sloped trail that hugged a shale cliff. The path had all but disappeared under leaves and branches, but there were still signs. Cut stone beneath dirt, rusted nails in old ties, a kind of man-made rhythm under the wild. I remember a squirrel scaring the hell out of me when it skittered past, tail flashing. And then, just beyond the bend, half covered in creeping moss and rain-loosened rock, I saw it. The mouth was wide enough for a man to duck into, though you'd scrape your shoulders. Black as coal inside. The strange thing was how the air changed. It wasn't just still, it moved. A slow draw inward, like the earth was breathing you in. And then, as I stepped close enough to feel it on my face, the tunnel exhaled. The wind that came out of it wasn't cold. It was warm, moist, like the breath of a fevered child. It smelled like wet pennies and wild onions. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if what I felt was some trick of geology, an old mine with pressure changes maybe, or temperature differential pulling the air like a draft. But it didn't feel scientific. It felt intentional. The silence had a weight to it, like the land itself was listening. I cleared my throat. Hello? The sound went in but didn't bounce back. There was a delay, maybe 3-4 seconds. And then something answered. Daniel. Not a shout, not an echo. A whisper shaped like my name, and soft enough that I nearly convinced myself I imagined it. Except it was Caleb's voice. It hit me so hard I stumbled backward into a patch of thorns. I didn't go in, didn't look any deeper. Just stared at that dark mouth in the earth, then turned and walked back toward my truck. I remember stopping halfway and looking back. The tunnel looked smaller from a distance, more like a dent in the hillside than a passage. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe my grief was playing tricks. But the next morning, I was drawn back. I told myself I was checking the map again, verifying elevation or seeing if the tunnel was recorded under a different name. But I brought no equipment, just my boots, a flashlight I never turned on, and a thermos of coffee I never touched. The tunnel didn't speak that day, but it hummed, low, like a deep chest murmur or the vibrating string of a cello. The sound rose and fell. Sometimes I thought it matched my breathing. I sat across from it on a fallen log for nearly an hour, just watching. The next day, it cried, a soft sobbing, too faint to place exactly, but clearly human. It went on for maybe 5 minutes. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and calm, like I was hearing something meant only for me. The next day, it said my name again, and then again, 2 days after that. By the second week, I stopped bringing my mapping tools altogether. I didn't tell my supervisor, just logged phony coordinates and wasted fuel on roundabout drives. I made excuses not to meet up with friends. I stopped calling Mom. I couldn't explain it. The tunnel had no story. It was barely even there, and yet it became the center of my thoughts. I dreamed of it, not going in, just being near it, sitting by the mouth, listening. On the 12th day, I took a folding chair. I'd sit there for hours, watching the wind ripple the vines around the edges, listening to the breath, the hums, the barely there syllables of things that might have been words. I stopped writing in my field notebook. My handwriting started slipping anyway. I misspelled my own name. A week after that, I took a wrong turn on a road I'd driven a dozen times. I blamed the mist, or maybe fatigue. But the truth is, I looked at the signs and nothing registered. I didn't know which direction to go home. The worst of it happened on a Tuesday. I woke up at noon, disoriented, clothes still muddy from the previous day. I couldn't remember if I'd even gone to the tunnel or not. The thermos was empty, my boots were wet, and I found 4 rocks in my coat pocket. I don't collect rocks. Not ever. But these were smooth, round, almost like teeth, and each one had a single scratch down the center. I told myself it was a coincidence, just weird debris. But my breath was shaky, and I felt a pressure behind my eyes. Not quite a headache, more like something waiting. I started avoiding mirrors, not because I looked bad, but because a few times I thought I saw movement behind me in the reflection, a shifting in the air, like the breath of the tunnel had found a way to follow. I finally called my mother. Her voice shook when she answered. She said she'd been trying to reach me for days, asked if I was taking my pills. I told her I hadn't needed them in years. She didn't seem convinced. I heard her crying when she hung up. That night, I tried to stay away, drove west instead of south, took unfamiliar turns until I ran out of gas near a logging road, slept in the cab of the truck fighting the pull in my chest. It felt like homesickness, but not for a place, for a sound. When I made it back the next morning, the tunnel was silent. No wind, no hum. The vines hung still. I felt a panic rise in me, sharp and cold, like it had left without me. I stepped closer, close enough to touch the stone. The air was dead, stale, and dry. I backed away, and something clicked underfoot. A small bone, bleached white, just one. I picked it up and saw the same straight groove as the rocks in my coat. That was the last time I saw the tunnel. I tried to find it again, retraced every path, rechecked every map. Nothing. The land had shifted somehow. Or maybe I had. I started keeping a recorder on me, trying to document things. But most days I forgot to turn it on, or I'd forget where I put it. I've been writing things down more, simple things. Grocery lists, family birthdays, my own address. But there are gaps. People I used to know, names I once said with ease, now just holes in my memory. There's a woman in a photo in my fridge. She's smiling with her hand on my shoulder. I don't know who she is. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of the tunnel again. I'm not inside it, just sitting near it, listening. And it's talking now. Not words exactly, just shape. The shape of something forming in the dark. Something that's not finished yet. Something that needs a name. Story 2. Beneath the church, it waited. The church sat on a hill just outside of Tannery Ridge, shingled in moss, forgotten by everyone except those of us with a contract and a shovel. The First Church of the Morning Light, it was called. Clapboard walls gone grey, steeple sagging, but the bones of it still held together. Somebody upstate decided it was worth saving for historical preservation, probably because it was one of the last buildings standing that dated back to the early coal years. A preservation grant came down through the county, and me, Jeremy, and Mr. Luther got tagged to do the structural assessment and prep the foundation for stabilization. It was good money, and work was slow, so we didn't ask too many questions. Mr. Luther was in his 70s and walked with a hard limp, the kind that doesn't fade with time. Used to be a coal inspector back when they still mined deep in those hills. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words had weight. First day on site, he refused to go inside the church. Just sat on a bucket out front, sipping black coffee from a thermos that looked older than me. "It's not just rot under there," he said, after Jeremy teased him for being superstitious. "There's a tunnel. Dug before the church. slabbed over in 2003, I think. Not the good kind of slab either, just bricks and prayers. "What kind of tunnel?" I asked. He just looked at me with those pale eyes of his. "The kind you leave shut." Jeremy and I joked about it, of course. All job sites have a ghost story. But sure enough, when we pulled back the floorboards under the sanctuary, we found an old concrete cap, irregularly poured and cracked down the middle, had a chunk of rebar rusting out like a broken rib. It wasn't part of the original church plan. We checked. "I say, we busted," Jeremy said. "Could be an old crawl space. Might even explain the slope issues." I hesitated. The air coming off the concrete was thick. It stank like wet iron and something deeper, earth that hadn't seen light in 100 years. Luther stayed outside that whole afternoon, silent. But money talks. We brought in a rotary hammer and chipped through the slab by the end of the week. The last layer gave out with a kind of pop, like a pressure seal breaking. The air that came up hissed. Not a breeze, not a draft, but something warmer, more deliberate, like the whole church took a breath through its foundation. Jeremy backed away laughing, shaking dust off his gloves, but I didn't laugh. The smell was wrong. Not just old, not just mold. There was a sweetness to it. A sweetness you only smell in something dead for too long. We left the opening covered that night just in case, and locked up the church. The next morning, the sanctuary pews were shifted. At first, we thought maybe some local kids had snuck in, but the lock was still bolted, and the boards over the windows hadn't been touched. Dust trails across the floor were disturbed, but not by shoes, more like dragging fabric or small hands. Jeremy started cracking nervous jokes about raccoons forming a prayer circle. Mr. Luther just watched us. He said, "Once the tunnel opens, the walls forget how to keep things out." Jeremy started sleeping badly after that. Said he had a dream that something buried was trying to breathe through his mouth. He said it filled his lungs with dirt. One morning, he came in with dried blood under his nose and dirt in his ears. Said he dreamed someone was praying beside his bed in a language that sounded like Latin if it was being spoken through molasses. The tunnel hole got stranger by the day. No matter how we covered it, boards, concrete bags, even tarps stapled to the joists, the coverings would be pulled back by morning. Not broken, just removed, set aside. The air had changed again. Sometimes when I stood near it, I swore I heard the rhythm of footsteps. Faint, slow, like someone pacing in a deep hallway. We stopped talking about it openly, just worked in silence, glancing at the shadowed hole like a stray dog you don't want to startle. Then Jeremy didn't show up. At first I figured he'd just had enough, but by noon I was worried. He lived in a trailer off an old gravel path past Smith's Hollow. No neighbors. I drove up there and found the door cracked open, the wind banging it against the frame. Inside was quiet. No signs of a struggle, no blood, but the air was damp, and the floor was wet. Not puddled exactly, just soaked through. The carpet squelched under my boots. There were handprints on the walls, low to the ground, thin, child-sized, trailing from the front room toward the back. All made in mud. Not red clay, either. Black muck, like the kind you find deep underground where no roots grow. Jeremy's phone sat on the counter, screen cracked, flashlight still on. His boots were by the door. His bed looked slept in but untouched. I called the sheriff. He said he'd send someone by, but we both knew nothing would come of it. Missing adults are hard to track, especially ones with no close family. I stayed in my truck that night, parked down the hill from the church, not quite able to leave. Something about it all felt wrong in a way that doesn't fit words, like I'd been tied to something without knowing. At 2:12 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the church bell, except the bell had been removed 5 years ago during structural prep. I checked the time twice. I even wrote it down on my hand. The sanctuary windows were glowing faintly, though there was no power. I walked up the slope, hands shaking, flashlight beams jittering against the old wood. Inside, the pews were full. Not with people exactly. Shapes, slumped shadows. None moved when I entered, but every one of them faced the altar. The hole beneath it was open, breathing again. I didn't stay. I don't remember how I got back to the truck, just that I didn't look behind me until I was already halfway down the gravel road. Mr. Luther was gone the next morning, never came to the site again. I heard later he moved in with his daughter downstairs, wouldn't talk about the church. The preservation project was halted 2 weeks later. Structural instability, they said. No one wanted to fund the rebuild. The slab was poured again, this time by a firm from Pikeville, and none of them asked questions. They didn't need to. The foreman quit a week later, citing recurring dreams. Jeremy was never found, not officially, but last month I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a field recorder, covered in dried mud. I cleaned it best I could and played the last audio file. It was 7 minutes of silence, then a whisper, low, dry, and unmistakably Jeremy's voice. All rise. Then the sound of pews creaking one by one. I still have the recording. I play it sometimes. I tell myself it's just my memory filling in the blanks, that the sound is just a coincidence. But late at night, if I play it on low volume, I swear I hear someone praying at the edge of the audio, and the voice isn't alone anymore. Story 3. The breath came through the floorboards. My cousin Eric had always liked jobs that kept him off-grid. He wasn't a loner exactly, but he preferred distance. Said it helped him think clearer when there weren't other people's noise bouncing off him all day. So when he landed the seasonal ranger post at Highcliffe Ridge, I wasn't surprised he took it without blinking. The post was remote, a one-room station with a cement base, halfway up a ridge no one visited unless they were hopelessly lost or purposefully escaping something. Just a cot, a radio, a generator, and a view of the valley that made you feel like the last soul left on Earth. The first few weeks, Eric sent me messages off the satellite relay, little stuff at first. Weird wind under the station, he wrote one night. Smells like pine tar and rust, keeps me up. I told him it was probably nothing. Old buildings settle, forest air shifts. But he kept bringing it up. Feels like something's breathing under the concrete, he said in one message. Not kidding. Comes in and out, like lungs the size of a train car. I laughed it off. He always had a streak for the dramatic, even as a kid. But after a while, the tone of his messages changed. Shorter, slower. He didn't ask about home or talk about the books he was reading anymore. Just little observations. Birds don't sing here after 8 p.m. or the trees point away from the ridge. I finally decided to visit him one weekend in October. Drove my dad's old truck up past the fire roads until the trees started thinning out. The air was dry, brittle like old leaves. When I got to the station, Eric looked thinner than I remembered. Not unhealthy, just like he hadn't been sleeping much. Or maybe like someone who was using all his energy to listen for something no one else could hear. We grilled hot dogs over the fire that night, and he hardly said a word, just stared off into the trees. When I finally asked about the breathing, he nodded slowly. "You'll feel it tonight," he said. "Comes up from under the floorboards, like it's waiting, like it knows when you're awake." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. That night, I laid on the cot while he took the floor, both of us wrapped in ranger-issued wool blankets. The station was quiet except for the soft ticking of the generator cooling down. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up without knowing why. Just that feeling like you forgot to lock a door. The room was dark. Eric was asleep, his breathing steady. And then I felt it, coming up through the mattress, through the floor and my spine. A breath, cool, damp air rising in cycles, like the whole concrete slab beneath us was the chest of something sleeping in the dirt. It wasn't sharp like wind or humid like rain, just soft, intentional. It didn't stop. I sat up. My hands were shaking. I reached down and placed my palm flat against the concrete floor. There, in, out, a rhythm. Slow and deep, like it had no reason to hurry. Eric opened his eyes but didn't say anything, just looked at me, then rolled back over. The next morning, I asked him about it. He shrugged and handed me a coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Said he'd found the source, or close to it. Wanted to show me. We went out behind the station with shovels and a crowbar. After scraping away brush and half-buried trash, he pointed to a square grate the size of a manhole, rusted shut, bent in places like someone had once tried to seal it permanently. The metal sang when we pried it loose. Below was a shaft, narrow and brick-lined, air swirling faintly upward. "You dropped anything down it?" I asked. Eric nodded. "Once. A flare. And never hit bottom." We sat there for a while. I leaned over the edge and spat. Count the seconds. Nothing. No echo. Just more breath. That night, the dreams came. I was lying on the cot again, only I wasn't in the station anymore. The walls were gone. The roof was gone. The stars above were wrong. Too many. Too sharp. I was pressed flat against the ground, and something was whispering below me, just on the edge of hearing. Not words. Shapes. Long vowels and wet consonants, like the way trees sound when you scream into the canopy and the forest doesn't want to answer. I woke up with my mouth full of dirt. Real dirt. I coughed for what felt like 5 minutes, trying to clear my throat. Eric was already outside, shirtless, barefoot, standing behind the station with his head tilted toward the shaft. I called his name twice before he turned around. His eyes were glassy, not like he was sleepwalking, like he'd been listening. He didn't talk much after that, wouldn't eat, wouldn't take the radio calls, just sat in a camp chair near the grate, back straight, face slack. One night I heard him muttering. I pressed my ear against the wall. He was praying, but not in English, not even Latin. Just sounds like water running backward. I left 2 days later. I had to. Something about that place. It wasn't just that it was off. It was pulling. Like being too close to a ledge you didn't remember walking toward. Eric didn't stop me. They found him 3 days after I called it in. He'd walked nearly a mile into the woods. No clothes. No bag. He left the station door wide open. The search team found him near a dry well no one had mapped. Just a pit in the earth lined with moss and old timbers. He was on his knees, palms flat to the ground, face pressed to the dirt like he was trying to hear something that the rest of us couldn't. He didn't resist when they brought him in. I didn't speak for a week. And when he did, the first thing he said was, "It's still breathing." He doesn't talk much these days. They put him in a facility down near the Tennessee border. Every few weeks, I visit. We play cards in silence, or I read to him. But sometimes, when the nurse opens the window and the breeze comes in through the screen, I catch him watching the floor and breathing with it. Story 4. Hollow voices behind the river wall. We used to throw rocks at the river tunnel when we were kids, like it was a dare. It sat half submerged on the far side of Buckhorn River, dark and gaping, the water licking its lips. There was a rumor it went straight under the mountain, an old freight pass from when coal ran thick through these parts, but it had been flooded since before I was born, and nobody I knew had ever been inside. By the time we were teenagers, it became a kind of ghost. We stopped talking about it, just a shadowed hole behind water and moss. I didn't think about that tunnel again for 20 years. Not until last summer when the river dipped so low you could walk across it without soaking your boots. Drought had bitten deep that year, killed half the corn upstate, dried ponds to mud. I was camping solo down near the old landing trail when I saw it again, fully exposed, the river pulled back like a curtain. The tunnel mouth yawned wide under the shale ridge. The stonework had cracked in places and thick weeds had grown around the base, but it was unmistakably the same as I remembered. Only now it looked hungrier. My dog, a black mutt named River, stopped cold the moment she saw it. She wouldn't go near it. Hackles up, tail down, she whimpered, turned in a slow circle and lay down, facing away, which I'd never seen her do. That should have been enough for me to leave it alone, but I didn't. I set up camp nearby, not too close, maybe 60 yards off, but close enough to keep it in view. I told myself it was curiosity, nostalgia, something about seeing a place buried your whole life finally revealed made it feel like a secret owed to you. But as the sky darkened and the heat faded from the rocks, I started feeling something else. Like the tunnel wasn't just revealed, it had waited. The first sound came sometime after midnight. It wasn't the usual night noise, no owls, no bugs, just a soft, rhythmic murmur, like water running beneath a grate, except the riverbed was bone dry near the tunnel, and this wasn't flowing, it was pressing, voices maybe, dozens, maybe hundreds, all overlapping like people muttering prayers into jars and burying them under gravel. The river growled low beside me. Her eyes were locked on the ground just past the firelight. I stood up and turned off the lantern, letting my eyes adjust. The dirt was moving, only slightly, but enough to notice, rising and falling in slow pulses like breath beneath a thin sheet. A spot near the tunnel, maybe 6 feet wide, bulging and settling every few seconds. I didn't move for a long time, just listened. Eventually, the murmuring stopped, and the earth went still. At sunrise, the place looked completely normal. The dirt was packed, no sign of shifting. The air smelled dry and mineral heavy, like river dust and brittle stone. River kept her distance from the tunnel all morning. I wouldn't even drink from her bowl until I moved it farther from the ridge. I should have packed up. I even loaded the cooler back into the truck, but something kept me tethered. The tunnel was open now, exposed, like it had been covered too long and finally wanted to be seen. I had to know. I had to see inside. Around noon, I walked to the entrance. The air coming out of it wasn't cold like I expected. It was still and heavy, carrying that same dry sweetness you get in a closed tomb, rot without scent. I crouched low, peering in. The walls inside were brick, worn smooth and moist with years of seep. It went back far, farther than I could see, and curved just slightly to the left, like it was hiding its end on purpose. There were scratch marks on the bricks, some are shallow, some deep, all going one direction, out. I called River softly. She didn't come. I backed away and returned to camp, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was just my imagination, old stories resurfacing. I remembered what my dad said once about this place, how in the old days they'd send prisoners through the tunnels when the trains stopped, forcing them to walk the pitch-black path back toward town. 1 or 2 never made it, said the air got bad, said they went crazy and clawed at the walls. But those were just coal town stories, weren't they? That night, I couldn't sleep. River whimpered at the edge of the tent, staring toward the dark. I sat up, the lantern dim, my breath catching in my throat. Because something knocked, not near the tunnel, not even outside. From beneath me, 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I scrambled out, dragging River with me. The fire had long since gone out, but the air was warm, too warm for night in the hills. I pressed my hand to the dirt. The ground vibrated faintly, like distant movement in a hollow space. I walked toward the tunnel, flashlight gripped tight. The beam bounced off stone, catching faint movement inside. Just dust, I told myself. But the deeper I peered, the more wrong it felt. The walls shivered. Not visibly, but in that way a body does when it knows it's being watched. I pressed my ear to the outer wall. At first, nothing. Just silence. Then, teeth. Not a sound exactly. A feeling. The scraping and shifting of small, hard things. Rattling, clicking, like someone grinding a mouthful of stone. I stepped back and didn't return to the tent. Just sat beside the truck with River pressed tight against my legs. Eyes open until the sky turns grey again. I left before full daylight. Didn't pack my gear, didn't fold the tent. I just threw what I could in the truck and drove until the road turned to asphalt and the air smelled like cut grass again. But the sound stayed. 2 days later, I woke up at home to dirt on my pillow. My boots were by the bed, caked in river mud. I didn't remember leaving, didn't remember anything at all past sunset. The next morning, I found River standing at the back door, growling at the floorboards. That's when I noticed it, the faint pulsing in the basement, like someone breathing just beneath the concrete slab. Slow, rhythmic. I haven't gone back to Buckhorn since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world gets quiet enough, I hear murmurs rise from the dirt behind my house, and the breath comes through the floor. Story 5. My grandfather's map Arctic No. After my grandfather passed, we cleaned out the shed behind his cabin, tucked up where the hills roll into the shadows of Shale Ridge. He was the quiet kind, always scribbling notes on paper scraps, always talking about the land like it had moods. In a drawer beneath his workbench, I found a hand-drawn map, faded pencil lines, dotted trails, landmarks only he would name, old blue tree, wife's first cry, where antlers die, but one mark stood out, a black circle near the edge of the ridge. No name, no note, just the word no, printed in hard, jagged strokes. It looked angry or scared. I went anyway. The trail there was nearly gone, swallowed by decades of rot and moss. I had to push through thickets of laurel and duck under damp branches that clung like hands. The spot was exactly where the map said it'd be, behind a wall of shale and vine. The entrance was small, half collapsed, breathing warm, stale air like the exhale of something sick. I ducked in with my flashlight, the beam flickering against rock wet with age. Inside, the walls were covered in carvings, not letters, not symbols I knew, spirals broken open, lines knotted around themselves. Some were shallow, others dug deep, like scratched by bone or rusted metal. The deeper I went, the more the heat thickened. It wasn't natural. It felt fevered, like walking inside a living wound. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own boots on the gravel, but when I stopped, they didn't. They kept going, one step more, soft, deliberate. I turned fast, the flashlight shaking. Nothing behind me, just the tunnel breathing, watching. I didn't run. I backed out slowly, heart pounding, every part of me screaming to not turn my back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps on the porch, then the hallway, then just outside my door. I don't know what I found out there. I just know my grandfather marked it no for a reason. And now I understand he wasn't warning himself. He was warning me. Story 6. The tunnel they sealed with teeth. We were just out looking for caves, me, Derek, and Lionel, 3 friends with second-hand gear and too much weekend. Lionel had found an old CCC map that marked a collapsed shaft near Devil's Rake. No one had touched that stretch of ridge in years. It was supposed to be sealed, buried under decades of runoff and bad memory. But we found an opening behind a curtain of roots, low and sharp-edged, breathing out air that smelled like rust and wet stone. The first chamber was narrow and slick. We moved slowly, boots sinking in places where the floor gave under layers of mud and bone. Then we saw it. A wall, not of rock or brick. Teeth, jaws, animal, maybe human, we couldn't tell. Set into the earth like bricks, hundreds of them. Some still with molars, some worn smooth, all pointed inward. It was too symmetrical to be natural. We whispered guesses, old ritual, coal miner superstition, but nobody laughed. The silence pressed in, thick and damp. Then we heard it, breathing, not ours, wet, panicked, like a horse trapped in a stall. We turned to leave, but the tunnel wasn't the same. It had shifted, curved. The air felt different, charged, tighter. The way the sound moved changed too, like we were speaking inside someone's throat. Then came the clacking, fast, hard, like teeth tapping against teeth. Not random, rhythmic, hungry. We never saw what made the sound. Just the light from Derek's headlamp spinning as he slipped, and his scream cutting short. Lionel grabbed my arm, but the path was gone behind us. Just more walls lined with jaws, grinning in the dark. Only I made it out. I don't remember how, but some nights I wake to the sound of clacking behind the walls, and my own teeth tapping back. Story 7. The Tunnel That Refused to Collapse. When I started sorting archives for the Bear Hook Ledger, I figured I'd be knee-deep in boring land disputes and school board minutes. But one afternoon, flipping through yellowed files in the back room, I found a series of photos labeled simply Ridge 9 Tunnel, Collapse Attempts. There were 6 pictures, all dated 1973, showing a narrow tunnel carved into the hillside outside Bear Hook. The first showed it intact. The next 2 showed it collapsed, blasted shut with rock and timber. But then, photo 4, it was open again. Same as the first. The next collapse, same result. Blown in, then clean by sunrise. I thought it was a filing error, until I saw the same exact image printed in a 1982 article, and again in 1994. Curious, I drove out to Ridge 9 with a copy of the old photo. It took me a while to find the path. It's not on any current maps. But when I stepped into that dry ravine, I knew I was in the right place. The tunnel looked exactly like the photos. Same shape, same angle of collapsed timber. Except it didn't collapse. It was just there, like it always had been. And the strangest thing, there was no life. No bugs, no birds, not even moss on the stones. The air was still and dry, like a sealed room. I stood at the entrance and said, "Hello?" What came back wasn't my voice, not exactly. It was faster, harsher, like it thought it knew how to echo but hadn't learned right. I said, "Who's in there?" And the answer came back wrong again. Who's in there? I didn't go in, but I stayed too long. Now, at night, I hear that same off-rhythm mimicry in the house, in the pipes, under the floor. And I don't think it's trying to echo anymore. I think it's practicing,